I am Douglas Montgomery. I am 70 years old, and I spent my entire life building a solid foundation so my son would never have to face the struggles I did. I am a retired structural engineer, a man who believes in measuring twice and cutting once. Last Tuesday, while drinking my morning coffee at my modest kitchen table, I opened an app on my tablet and saw my only son, Cameron, in a bespoke tuxedo, kissing his new bride at a lavish wedding. I was not invited. The caption beneath the photo read, "Finally found where I truly belong. Real family is everything." I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I simply put down my coffee mug, picked up my phone, called my corporate attorney, and ordered the immediate sale of the $2 million suburban estate my son was currently living in. Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that respect is something to be earned, not blindly inherited. The morning sun was cutting through the blinds of my kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was quiet. It had been quiet since my wife Martha passed away a decade ago. I sat in my usual wooden chair, the tablet resting flat on the table. The screen glowed with the undeniable evidence of my son's ultimate betrayal. I stared at the photograph. It was taken at a high-end vineyard in Napa Valley, a place known for its exorbitant event fees. Cameron stood tall, his hair perfectly styled, wearing a custom-tailored Italian tuxedo. I recognized the fabric and the cut, because I had paid the tailor's invoice just 3 months prior, under the guise that Cameron needed it for a charity gala. Beside him stood Vanessa Lawson, his new wife, draped in a designer silk gown that easily cost the equivalent of a luxury car. Flanking the newlyweds were Vanessa's parents, Howard and Diane Lawson. Howard wore a smug, self-satisfied grin, holding a glass of champagne, playing the role of the wealthy patriarch. I zoomed in on the image. I studied the details with the clinical precision I used to reserve for inspecting stress fractures in steel beams. On Cameron's left wrist sat a vintage Patek Philippe watch. I had given him that watch on the day he graduated from college. It was a timepiece meant for a man of substance, a man who understood the weight of responsibility. Seeing it now, flashing in the California sun as he celebrated a secret life built on my dime, felt like a physical blow. But the blow did not break me. It crystallized my resolve. For years, I had endured Vanessa's condescending remarks about my simple lifestyle. I had watched Howard and Diane parade around country clubs, projecting an image of generational wealth, while I quietly covered the deficits in their daughter's extravagant lifestyle. I had tolerated it all because Cameron was my son, and a father provides. But looking at that caption, proclaiming he had finally found his real family, the final thread of my parental obligation snapped. The heat of anger was replaced by the absolute freezing cold of clarity. I was no longer a father indulging a spoiled child. I was an engineer observing a structurally compromised asset, and it was time to demolish the building. I closed the social media application and immediately opened my secure banking portal. The screen loaded, displaying a network of joint accounts, trust funds, and high-limit credit lines that I had maintained for Cameron since he turned 21. The numbers on the screen represented decades of my hard work, late nights at the drafting table, and calculated investments. I navigated to the primary platinum credit card. The recent transaction history was a roadmap of their deceit. There were massive charges for private wine tastings, boutique floral arrangements, and first-class plane tickets to Bora Bora. They were currently sitting on a beach halfway across the world, drinking cocktails funded by the very man they had deliberately excluded from their lives. I clicked on the Account Management tab. My finger hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second before pressing the button labeled Revoke Authorized User. A confirmation prompt appeared. I confirmed it. The account status instantly changed from active to suspended. I did not stop there. I moved to the joint checking account, which was essentially a bottomless reservoir Cameron used to fund his daily luxury habits, from expensive dinners to premium car leases. I initiated a wire transfer, draining the entire liquid balance of that account directly into my private, single-signer trust. Within 4 minutes, I dismantled the financial infrastructure that allowed Cameron and Vanessa to pretend they were independent, wealthy adults. The financial umbilical cord was severed completely and permanently. They were now in a foreign country with pieces of useless plastic in their wallets. I locked the tablet, stood up from the table, and walked over to my study. I picked up the landline phone and dialed the direct office number for Stephen Gallagher. Stephen was my corporate attorney, a man whose ruthlessness in the courtroom was matched only by his efficiency. He answered on the second ring. I did not offer any morning pleasantries. I told him to pull the file on the Oak Brook property immediately. The Oak Brook property was a sprawling 5-bedroom estate in an exclusive gated community. I had purchased it entirely in cash 5 years ago. Cameron lived there rent-free, treating it as his own personal castle to impress Vanessa and her status-obsessed parents. Stephen's voice was crisp and professional as he confirmed he had the file open. I instructed him to list the property for sale by the end of the business day. Stephen paused. He asked if Cameron was aware of this decision and if we needed to secure a new lease agreement for his relocation. I told Stephen that Cameron was currently on his honeymoon in Bora Bora and that he would be coming back to a locked door. I explained that I was done playing the silent benefactor to a son who viewed me as nothing more than an ATM. Stephen did not ask for emotional details. He is a man who operates on facts and legal standing. He verified the deed. The property was solely in the name of my holding company. Cameron had absolutely no legal claim to the house. He was, by definition, a guest who had overstayed his welcome. However, Stephen quickly identified the critical roadblock. He informed me that while I had every right to sell my own property, the logistics of a rapid sale presented a significant challenge. A few months prior, an all-cash buyer had approached us with a highly lucrative offer for that specific lot, intending to tear down the house and build a custom mansion. That buyer was still interested, but they required the property to be delivered completely vacant and broom-swept. Stephen explained the legal complication. Because Cameron had established residency, I could not simply throw his belongings onto the lawn without risking a drawn-out civil dispute over damaged property or illegal eviction protocols. To close this cash deal and permanently liquidate the asset before Cameron could attempt any legal maneuvering, the house had to be entirely emptied of his and Vanessa's high-end furniture, designer clothes, and personal effects. The silence hung on the phone line as I processed the information. Stephen stated the timeline clearly. We had exactly 14 days before the newlyweds returned from their island getaway. 14 days to pack up the entirety of my son's fraudulent life. I looked around my quiet, empty study. I felt a surge of energy I had not experienced in years. I told Stephen to draft the listing agreement and contact the cash buyer immediately. I would not hire a crew to do the packing. I would not delegate this task to strangers. I told my lawyer I would go to the Oak Brook estate today, and I would personally dismantle the false reality I had allowed my son to build. The trap was set, the clock was ticking, and I was going to pack away every single lie in a cardboard box. The drive to the Oak Brook estate took exactly 42 minutes. I did not listen to the radio. I listened to the hum of the engine and mentally mapped out the floor plan of the house I had purchased but rarely visited. I pulled my 10-year-old truck into the sweeping circular driveway, parking it directly behind the spot where Cameron usually kept his leased German sports car. The house loomed ahead of me, a massive structure of stone and glass that projected an image of absolute success. I walked up the bluestone steps carrying a heavy roll of industrial packing tape and a bundle of flattened cardboard boxes I had purchased from a local hardware store. I took my master key from my pocket. It slid into the heavy brass lock with a satisfying click. I pushed the solid oak door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside was stale, heavily perfumed with the lingering scent of some expensive designer room spray Vanessa insisted on using. I dropped the bundle of cheap cardboard onto the imported Italian marble floor. The dull thud echoed through the cavernous space. I looked around the living room. It was staged like a showroom filled with velvet sofas, oversized modern art pieces, and fragile glass tables that served absolutely no practical purpose. It was a monument to superficiality funded entirely by the man they had decided to erase from their lives. I did not feel a pang of sadness looking at the room. I felt the precise, calculated energy of an engineer about to dismantle a structurally unsound bridge. I unfolded the first cardboard box, squared the corners, and dragged the heavy tape across the bottom seams. The sharp, ripping sound of the adhesive tape cut through the silence of the house like a starting gun. I began in the living room. I did not pack with care. I did not wrap their decorative vases in bubble wrap, or gently fold the cashmere throw blankets resting on the sofa. I grabbed handfuls of fragile luxury and dropped them into the abrasive brown boxes. A crystal decanter went in next to a stack of unread leather-bound coffee table books meant only for display. I sealed the box, wrote living room garbage on the side with a thick black marker, and pushed it toward the front door. I moved with a mechanical rhythm. Box after box, room after room, I stripped the house of its pretentious personality. I was not preserving memories. I was clearing cubic footage to prepare for a real estate transaction. In the custom kitchen, I found appliances that had never been used. A 6-burner commercial stove sat spotless. A built-in espresso machine, worth more than my first car, gathered dust. I opened the walk-in pantry. It was stocked with imported truffles, artisanal olive oils, and expensive gourmet snacks. I swept my arm across the shelves, knocking the jars and boxes directly into a trash bag. They did not deserve the dignity of being packed. I dragged the heavy bag to the garage and threw it next to the recycling bins. I moved to the wine refrigerator. It was filled with rare vintages Cameron had purchased using the joint account I had just suspended. I pulled the bottles out one by one, tossing them into a heavy-duty box. The glass clinked together violently. I did not care if they shattered. They were no longer investments. They were just objects occupying space in my property. By early afternoon, the ground floor was nothing more than a collection of sealed brown cubes stacked against the walls. The illusion of their grandeur was completely boxed up. The house was beginning to look like what it truly was, an empty shell waiting for a new owner. My back ached from the physical labor, a sharp reminder of my 70 years, but I ignored it. Pain is just a signal, and right now the only signal I cared about was completion. I drank a glass of tap water, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and looked toward the grand, sweeping staircase leading to the second floor. The master suite was up there, the absolute center of their entitled universe. I carried a fresh stack of flattened boxes up the carpeted stairs. I pushed open the double doors to the master bedroom. The space was enormous, dominated by a custom king-size bed and flanked by massive walk-in closets. I walked directly into Cameron Closet. It looked like a high-end boutique. Rows of tailored suits, silk ties organized by color, and dozens of pairs of handmade leather shoes lined the shelves. This was the armor he wore to convince the world he was a self-made man. I grabbed a large box and started pulling suits off the rack hangers and all shoving them indiscriminately into the cardboard. The expensive fabrics wrinkled and crushed against each other. I tossed the leather shoes on top, completely ruining the polished finish. I moved to Vanessa Closet next. It was a shrine to excessive consumerism. Designer handbags were displayed behind glass cases like museum artifacts. I did not bother opening the cases gently. I yanked the doors open, grabbed the bags by their delicate straps, and threw them into the nearest box. I piled her expensive dresses and imported shoes on top until the box was overflowing. I forced the cardboard flaps down, crushing the contents inside, and sealed it with 3 tight strips of tape. I dragged the heavy boxes out of the closets and lined them up at the foot of the oversized bed. The room was rapidly losing its luxurious appeal, reduced to a staging area for their impending eviction. As I turned to grab another box to clear out the nightstands, my boot caught the edge of a thick Persian rug near the corner of the room. The rug bunched up, revealing a section of the hardwood floor beneath it. I bent down to straighten the rug, intending to keep the floor clear for the movers I would hire tomorrow. But as I pulled the heavy wool fabric back, my eyes caught a metallic glint catching the afternoon light filtering through the window. Built directly into the floorboards, completely hidden from casual view, was a heavy steel safe. The digital keypad on the front was dark, but the heavy metal handle was not fully engaged. In their frantic rush to pack for their secret wedding and extravagant honeymoon, they had made a critical, arrogant mistake. The safe was unlocked. I stared at the heavy steel door of the floor safe. The digital keypad was completely dark, but the thick metal handle was resting at a slight angle, indicating the locking mechanism had not engaged. Cameron had always been careless with details. He possessed a terrifying arrogance that made him believe he was immune to consequences. I reached down and grasped the cold steel handle. It was heavy, requiring a firm pull. The thick hinges groaned slightly as I swung the heavy door open, revealing the dark cavity embedded in the subfloor. I expected to find stacks of cash, or perhaps the expensive diamond jewelry Vanessa flaunted at country club dinners. I expected the typical hoard of a materialistic couple obsessed with liquid wealth. Instead, the interior of the safe was entirely filled with thick manila folders and legal envelopes tightly packed together. I knelt on the hardwood floor, my joints protesting the awkward angle, and reached into the dark space. I pulled out the top folder. It was surprisingly heavy. I opened it and spread the contents across the crushed velvet of Vanessa discarded evening gowns that were spilling from a nearby box. The first page bore the official seal of a major commercial bank. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It was the same financial institution I had used for decades to manage my commercial real estate portfolio. My eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the document. It was a commercial loan agreement, a secondary mortgage. I read the property address listed in the collateral section, and my breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. It was my warehouse complex on the south side of the city, a highly profitable commercial property I had purchased outright 20 years ago and currently leased to a logistics company. I flipped to the second page, my hands steady but my mind racing through a rapid series of calculations. The loan amount listed was staggering: $400,000. I had never taken out a loan against that property. I had always prided myself on operating without debt. I moved to the final page, the signature section. There, at the bottom of the densely typed legal jargon, was my name: Douglas Montgomery. The signature was executed in blue ink. It looked remarkably similar to my own handwriting. The sharp angles of the uppercase letters and the precise loops were all present. But I had spent 40 years drafting structural blueprints and signing off on load-bearing capacities. I knew the exact pressure I applied to a pen. I knew the slight hesitation at the end of the letter Y. This signature was a flawless mechanical reproduction. It lacked the natural flow of my hand. It was a forgery. I sat back on my heels, the realization washing over me like a wave of ice water. Cameron had not just been siphoning money from the joint accounts I willingly provided. He had actively, systematically defrauded me. He had used his knowledge of my financial holdings and his access to my personal information to leverage my hard-earned assets. I pulled another folder from the safe. This one contained a deed of trust against a small retail strip mall I owned in the neighboring county. Another forged signature. Another fraudulent loan. This one for $250,000. The dates on the documents corresponded perfectly with the timeline of his escalating lifestyle. The loan against the warehouse coincided with his purchase of the leased German sports car and Vanessa engagement ring. The strip mall loan was dated just 4 months ago, perfectly aligning with the exorbitant expenses of the secret Napa Valley wedding and the Bora Bora honeymoon. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. Cameron had effectively stolen over $500,000 by placing heavy financial encumbrances on my unburdened properties. If these loans defaulted, the banks would have the legal right to seize my life work. My son had weaponized my trust and transformed my legacy into a ticking time bomb of debt to finance his pathetic illusion of grandeur. I looked at the forged signatures again. I remembered teaching Cameron how to write his name when he was a little boy, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had discovered his betrayal this morning. I remembered guiding his small hand to form the letters. He had used that same hand to carefully, meticulously practice stealing my identity. There was no sadness left in my chest. The betrayal had burned through every ounce of parental affection I possessed, leaving nothing but a vast, empty space of cold calculation. Cameron was no longer a disappointing son. He was a criminal liability. He had crossed the line from entitlement to felony fraud. I carefully gathered the documents from the velvet dresses and placed them into a single neat stack. I did not shove them into the cardboard boxes with his suits and shoes. These pieces of paper were not garbage. They were ammunition. They were the undeniable structural flaws in the foundation of the fake life he had built. I pulled my cellular phone from my pocket. The camera function was the most powerful tool I had at this exact moment. I turned on the bright overhead lights in the master bedroom. I placed each document flat on the glass surface of Vanessa's vanity table and photographed every single page. I made sure the lighting was perfect, capturing the forged signatures, the bank seals, and the fraudulent notary stamps with absolute clarity. I photographed the loan agreements, the promissory notes, and the falsified income statements Cameron had submitted to the bank. I created a complete, unassailable digital archive of his crimes. The packing could wait for a few minutes. I had found the exact mechanism he used to steal my resources, and now I possessed the blueprints to his destruction. I placed my cellular phone back into my pocket. I did not leave the fraudulent documents scattered on the glass surface of the vanity table. I gathered each page with deliberate care. I arranged them chronologically, ensuring the timeline of my son's betrayal was perfectly preserved. The dates on the paper formed a flawless map of his escalating greed. I took a thick plastic folder from the bottom of my heavy leather work bag. I slid the forged commercial loan agreements, the falsified tax returns, the fake property appraisals, and the counterfeit notary stamps into the secure folder. I pressed the plastic seal completely shut. I would not leave this evidence inside the house. I had the safe combination now, but I trusted absolutely no one. I walked out of the master bedroom, leaving the crushed designer clothes in their cheap cardboard boxes. I walked down the sweeping carpeted staircase to the quiet living room. I needed a clear space to make the next phone call. I sat on one of the few remaining wooden dining chairs the staging crew had not yet removed. I pulled out my phone and dialed the private number for Vincent Cole. Vincent was my personal forensic accountant. He was a former federal auditor who specialized in tracking hidden assets and untangling complex financial frauds for high-net-worth individuals. He was not a man who dealt in emotions or offered useless sympathies. He dealt exclusively in numbers and the absolute truth those numbers revealed. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice low and professional. I did not waste time asking about his day or making small talk. I told him I needed his immediate attention on a matter of severe financial compromise. I told him my son had successfully executed a series of fraudulent commercial loans against my primary real estate holdings. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and focused. Vincent did not gasp or express shock. He simply asked for the exact figures. I recited the numbers from the documents I had just secured in my bag. $400,000 against the Southside warehouse complex. $250,000 against the retail strip mall in the neighboring county. I told him the total exposure was $650,000. I explained that Cameron had forged my signature perfectly, bypassing the commercial lending security protocols at a major regional bank. I told Vincent I had photographic evidence of every single page, including falsified corporate income statements that utilized my actual tax identification numbers and personal social security number. Vincent began typing rapidly on his computer keyboard. I could hear the sharp, deliberate clicks through the phone receiver. He told me the situation was significantly more dangerous than a simple theft. He explained that by forging my signature on commercial lending documents and transmitting those documents across state lines, Cameron had committed multiple federal felonies. This was not just family theft or simple identity fraud. It was bank fraud and federal wire fraud. Vincent stated clearly that if the lending bank discovered the forgery before we controlled the narrative, they would immediately call the commercial loans due in full. They would freeze my entire real estate portfolio and potentially initiate foreclosure proceedings to seize my properties and cover the fraudulent debt. My son had not just stolen cash from a checking account. He had strapped a massive financial explosive to the foundation of my life work. I listened to the steady rhythm of Vincent typing as I processed the gravity of the threat. Vincent asked me how Cameron managed to receive the funds. A commercial bank does not simply hand over $650,000 in cash to an unverified individual. The money had to be wired to a corporate account bearing my exact name or the registered name of my holding company. I looked around the empty living room, taking in the sheer size of the fraudulent lifestyle I had funded. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Cameron must have created a shadow bank account. He must have incorporated a fake shell company with a name nearly identical to my legitimate corporate entity. He used that shadow account to receive the massive loan disbursements from the bank. Once the money was secured in the fake corporate account, he slowly funneled the funds into his own personal checking accounts to finance the extravagant lifestyle, the imported cars, and the secret destination wedding. I instructed Vincent to initiate a full forensic audit of every financial institution linked to my Social Security number and my corporate tax identification numbers. I told him to hunt down the shadow account. I needed to know exactly where every single dollar had been deposited and where it had been spent. I needed the routing numbers, the transaction histories, the dates of every wire transfer, and the IP addresses used to authorize the movements. Vincent confirmed the order without hesitation. He told me he would deploy his team immediately and have a preliminary tracing report within 24 hours. He advised me to say absolutely nothing to Cameron or the regional bank until we had the entire financial map firmly in our hands. Premature disclosure to the bank could trigger an automated asset freeze that would paralyze my legitimate business operations and drain my operational capital. I ended the call and placed the phone on the wooden table. The silence of the empty house settled around me again, heavier this time. The absolute severity of the crime was now fully established. My son was looking at a minimum of a decade in a federal penitentiary if I handed this plastic folder to the authorities right now. But I was not going to hand it over yet. The federal investigators would lock him up, but they would not protect my hard-earned assets from the aggressive legal departments of the commercial banks. I had to surgically separate my legitimate financial empire from his fraudulent debt before I dropped the legal hammer. I had the physical evidence. I had the forensic expert tracking the stolen money. I stood up from the wooden chair. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the imported marble floor. I still had half a house to pack into cheap cardboard boxes, and a real estate agent was expecting a completely empty property tomorrow morning. I picked up my heavy roll of industrial packing tape. The financial war had officially begun, but the physical labor was not yet finished. The following morning began with the heavy, aggressive rumble of diesel engines. Precisely at 7 o'clock, two massive commercial moving trucks backed into the sweeping circular driveway of the Oak Brook estate. I had not slept much. I had spent the night resting on a cheap air mattress in the downstairs office, guarding the heavy plastic folder containing the undeniable evidence of my son's federal crimes. When the removal crew arrived, I unlocked the solid oak front door and gave the foreman a single simple directive. I told him to take absolutely everything that was not permanently bolted to the walls or the floor. I stood back and watched as 8 burly men marched into the house and began the systematic physical dismantling of Cameron and Vanessa's manufactured kingdom. The heavy velvet sofas in the living room were wrapped tightly in industrial plastic and hauled out the front doors. The fragile imported glass tables that served no purpose other than to display expensive art books were carefully taken apart and loaded onto the trucks. I stood in the grand marble foyer and listened to the distinct sounds of extraction. The loud grunts of the workers, the squeak of heavy rubber wheels rolling across the polished floors, the heavy thuds of custom furniture being strapped tightly into the dark cargo bays. With every single piece that crossed the threshold, the house felt physically lighter. The oppressive, suffocating weight of their entitlement was being removed cubic foot by cubic foot. The massive custom bed from the master suite took 4 men to carry down the sweeping, carpeted staircase. It was the bed where they had likely discussed their plans to manipulate me, where they had laughed at my simple life while sleeping on a mattress I had paid for entirely in cash. Now it was just another heavy object bound for a generic climate-controlled storage unit on the industrial edge of town. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the ground floor was a cavernous, echoing void. The last of the cheap cardboard boxes, containing their designer clothes and expensive shoes, had been stacked in the corner of the garage waiting for final transport. The removal trucks finally pulled away, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence. I was sweeping the imported marble floor in the foyer when a sleek black sedan pulled into the driveway. Evelyn, my luxury real estate broker, stepped out of the vehicle. Evelyn was a sharp, pragmatic woman who understood the high-end market better than anyone in the county. She did not ask unnecessary questions about why a $2 million estate was suddenly completely empty. She only cared about closing the transaction and securing her commission. A few minutes later, a second vehicle arrived. It was a dark, heavy luxury sports utility vehicle. The cash buyer stepped out onto the driveway. He was a wealthy commercial property developer named Kensington. He did not wear a tailored suit. He wore dark jeans and a crisp white shirt, projecting the quiet, absolute confidence of a man who moved millions of dollars before breakfast. Evelyn led him through the front doors. Kensington stood in the empty foyer and looked around the cavernous, echoing space. He did not admire the imported marble floors or the expensive custom ceiling molding. He looked at the property the exact same way I did. He saw a prime plot of land with a structure that needed to be demolished immediately. Kensington walked through the empty living room, his heavy leather boots echoing loudly against the bare floors. He walked directly into the custom kitchen and tapped the flawless granite countertops. He turned to Evelyn and nodded his head once. He stated clearly that the lot size was absolutely perfect for the new massive architectural footprint he had in mind. The house itself meant nothing to him. He was going to bring in heavy machinery and level the entire structure to pour a completely new foundation. Evelyn smiled her bright professional smile and opened her leather briefcase, prepared to discuss the standard 30-day closing window. Kensington raised his hand abruptly to stop her. He looked directly at me. His expression was completely serious and devoid of any emotion. He stated that he was prepared to offer $200,000 over the initial asking price completely in cash, with zero contingencies and absolutely no inspection periods. It was an incredibly aggressive, highly lucrative offer that would instantly liquidate my asset and provide me with a massive influx of untraceable liquid capital. But there was a strict, non-negotiable condition attached to the premium price. Kensington explained that his municipal building permits for the new luxury construction were set to expire very soon. He could not wait 30 days. He could not even wait 2 weeks. He demanded that the final closing documents be signed, the legal title transferred, and the keys handed over in exactly 5 days. The words hung heavily in the empty, echoing kitchen. 5 days. My mind immediately processed the timeline with cold, mechanical precision. Cameron and Vanessa were currently drinking expensive cocktails on a white sand beach in Bora Bora. Their return flight was booked for exactly 13 days from now. They fully expected to come back to a fully furnished luxury estate ready to continue their parasitic existence and manage the minor fallout of their secret wedding. If I accepted this aggressive timeline, I would not just be locking them out of the house. I would be legally transferring the ownership of the ground beneath their feet to a demolition crew. By the time their return flight landed at the international airport, this house would likely be surrounded by tall, chain-link construction fences and actively guarded by private security. Evelyn looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and professional anticipation. She knew a 5-day closing on a property of this massive scale was nearly impossible to execute under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. I was not a sentimental homeowner dragging my feet. I was a structural engineer executing a perfectly controlled demolition of a fraudulent life. I looked around the empty kitchen that my son had used to entertain his fake friends using my stolen money. I thought about the forged commercial loan documents currently sitting in the heavy plastic folder inside my work bag. The trap was already set, but Kensington had just handed me the perfect opportunity to drastically accelerate the detonator. I turned back to the developer. I did not negotiate the terms. I did not ask for a single moment to consider the logistics. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out my favorite heavy drafting pen. I told Kensington that if his legal team could produce the final binding contract by tomorrow morning, I would sign it immediately. We shook hands right there in the empty, echoing kitchen. The collision course was no longer a distant threat looming at the end of the month. The timeline had violently accelerated. My son had exactly 5 days before the entire foundation of his life completely vanished. 13 days had passed since I signed the final closing documents. I sat in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old truck, parked half a block down the quiet street from the Oak Brook estate. The afternoon sun was warm, but the air inside my cab was perfectly cool. I kept my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel and watched the sweeping circular driveway. Exactly on schedule, a sleek black luxury sports utility vehicle pulled up to the curb. It was a premium rideshare service from the international airport. The rear doors opened, and my son stepped out onto the pristine bluestone driveway. Cameron looked incredibly relaxed. His skin carried the deep bronze tan of 2 weeks spent lounging under the tropical sun of Bora Bora. He wore tailored linen trousers and a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Vanessa stepped out from the other side wearing a designer sun hat and oversized sunglasses. They looked like a magazine advertisement for effortless generational wealth. The driver unloaded 4 massive heavy leather suitcases, placing them carefully at the bottom of the front steps. Cameron did not offer the man a tip. He simply waved his hand, dismissing the driver, who quickly pulled out of the driveway, leaving them alone in front of the massive stone house. Cameron grabbed the handles of 2 heavy suitcases and dragged them up the front steps. Vanessa followed closely behind, complaining loudly about the duration of the flight and how desperately she needed a long hot bath in their custom marble tub. I watched through my windshield as Cameron reached into his pocket and pulled out his silver keyring. He pushed the brass key into the heavy front door lock. He turned his wrist, but the lock did not yield. Kensington had completely replaced all the exterior locks within 2 hours of our legal closing. Cameron frowned and pulled the key out, inspecting it closely to ensure it was the correct one. He pushed it back in and tried again, putting his shoulder against the heavy wood. The door remained entirely solid and unyielding. Vanessa let out a sharp sigh of annoyance, asking him why he was struggling with a simple door. Cameron muttered something under his breath and reached out to the digital security keypad mounted on the stone frame. He punched in his 4-digit code. The small screen flashed a bright red error message. The code was invalid. The security system had been entirely replaced and reprogrammed. Panic is a fascinating emotion to observe from a distance. I watched the initial annoyance on my son's face slowly contort into genuine confusion and then rapidly escalate into raw anger. He began pounding his fist against the solid oak door. The heavy thuds echoed down the quiet suburban street. He shouted his own name, demanding that whoever was inside open the door immediately. Vanessa dropped her iced coffee on the bluestone steps, the brown liquid staining the pristine stone. She stepped up to the large front window and cupped her hands around her face, peering through the tinted glass. I knew exactly what she was seeing. Kensington had temporarily leased the property on a short-term basis to a family relocating from across the country, while his demolition permits cleared the city council. The cavernous living room was no longer empty. It was currently filled with the chaotic energy of a family actively moving their lives into the space. There were children running across the imported marble floors and unfamiliar adults unpacking boxes in the custom kitchen. Vanessa stumbled back from the window, her face pale despite the tropical tan. She grabbed Cameron by the arm and pointed frantically toward the glass. Cameron dropped the heavy leather suitcases and rushed to the window, pressing his face against it. When he saw the strangers occupying the space he had fraudulently claimed as his own, his anger exploded into a violent rage. He began kicking the heavy front door with the heel of his expensive leather shoes. He screamed obscenities, demanding that the intruders vacate his property. The new tenants inside the house were understandably terrified. A large, angry man was attempting to violently breach their front door, while a woman screamed hysterically on the porch. I watched as the father of the new family quickly approached the window, holding his cellular phone to his ear. He was speaking frantically and pointing directly at Cameron. He was doing exactly what any responsible father would do when faced with an unhinged aggressor attempting to break into his home. He was calling the local police department to report a home invasion in progress. Cameron did not stop. His entitlement blinded him to the reality of the situation. He genuinely believed that if he made enough noise, the universe would simply bend to his will and return his stolen lifestyle. He left the front porch and began marching around the perimeter of the house, pulling violently on every window frame and rattling the side gates. Vanessa remained on the front steps, sobbing and frantically dialing numbers on her phone, likely trying to reach my suspended accounts or her equally fraudulent parents. 5 minutes later, the quiet suburban street was violently disrupted by the wailing sound of approaching sirens. 2 white and blue police cruisers turned the corner at high speed, their emergency lights flashing brightly against the manicured lawns. They skidded to a halt at the bottom of the circular driveway, completely blocking the exit. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles, immediately resting their hands on their duty belts. The officers moved with coordinated tactical precision. They drew their tasers and loudly ordered Cameron to step away from the side window and return to the front driveway with his hands completely visible. Cameron was breathless and red in the face. He marched toward the officers not with compliance, but with the arrogant indignation of a wealthy man who believed he was above the law. He shouted at the police, telling them they needed to arrest the squatters inside his house. He pointed aggressively at the front door, demanding that the officers remove the strangers immediately. The lead officer calmly instructed Cameron to lower his voice and asked for identification and proof of residency. Cameron patted his pockets frantically, searching for a wallet that contained nothing but suspended credit cards. He loudly declared that his name was Cameron Montgomery and that this estate was his primary residence. The officer unclipped a small radio from his shoulder and requested a property records check for the address. I sat quietly in my truck, the engine still running. The foundation of his fake life had completely vanished, and the reality of his actions was about to crush him under its massive weight. The chaos had peaked, and the stage was perfectly set for my arrival. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine of my old truck fell silent. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers painted the quiet suburban street in harsh, erratic strokes. I stepped out of the cab, my boots hitting the asphalt with a heavy, deliberate thud. I walked to the rear of the truck and lowered the tailgate. Resting in the bed were 3 thick, industrial black garbage bags. I had kept these aside when the staging company cleared the house. They contained the absolute bare minimum of Cameron and Vanessa designer clothing, the items they would need for the immediate future. I grabbed the heavy plastic necks of the bags in each hand and hauled them over the tailgate. They were heavy, but the adrenaline of absolute finality surged through my veins, masking any physical strain. I walked down the sidewalk toward the chaotic scene unfolding at the bottom of the circular driveway. The air was thick with the humid heat of the late afternoon and the sharp crackle of the police radios. As I approached the perimeter of the cruisers, one of the officers turned and placed a hand firmly on his duty belt, instructing me to stand back. I did not stop walking. Stop. I maintained eye contact with the officer and stated clearly and calmly that my name was Douglas Montgomery, and I was the father of the man currently screaming on the driveway. Cameron spun around at the sound of my voice. His face was slick with sweat and twisted into a mask of furious indignation. He pointed a trembling finger at me and yelled at the officers, telling them I was the owner of the house and I could clear up this ridiculous misunderstanding immediately. He demanded that I order the police to arrest the intruders inside his home. He spoke to me not as a son asking for help, but as a superior officer demanding compliance from a subordinate. He genuinely believed I had arrived to rescue him from his own chaotic mess. I walked directly past the officers and stopped exactly 3 feet away from my son. I did not look at Vanessa, who was still weeping loudly on the bluestone steps. I looked directly into Cameron's eyes. I dropped the heavy black garbage bags onto the pristine driveway. The thick plastic hit the pavement with a loud slapping sound. The top of one bag split open, spilling a pile of wrinkled, custom-tailored linen shirts and a pair of expensive Italian leather loafers onto the dirty ground. Cameron stared at the spilled clothing, his mouth opening and closing, like a fish completely devoid of oxygen. He looked from the garbage bags to my face, his expression morphing from arrogant rage to profound confusion. I turned to the lead police officer who was watching the exchange with cautious, professional interest. I reached into my back pocket and retrieved my state-issued identification card, handing it directly to the officer. I spoke in a loud, clear voice, ensuring that every single person present, including the terrified new tenants watching from the window, could hear me perfectly. I informed the officer that I was the former legal owner of the property. I stated that the house had been legally sold and the title successfully transferred earlier that week. I clarified that the people currently inside the house were the lawful occupants authorized by the new property owner. Finally, I pointed directly at my son and stated unequivocally that Cameron had absolutely no legal right to be on the premises and was actively trespassing. The silence that fell over the driveway was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the police cruiser engines. The officer looked at my identification, then looked at Cameron, his stance shifting from de-escalation to enforcement. Cameron stumbled backward as if I had physically struck him. He looked at the house, then at the garbage bags, and finally at me. He screamed that I was lying. He shouted that the house was his, that it was a wedding gift, that I had promised it to him. His voice cracked, pitching upward into a desperate, manic frequency. He took a step towards me, his fists clenched tight at his sides, demanding to know what I had done with his furniture and his life. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I reached inside the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It felt incredibly heavy, containing the undeniable weight of his own destruction. I held it out toward him. Cameron stared at the envelope, hesitating, before snatching it from my hand with a violent jerk. He ripped the top flap open and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I watched his eyes dart rapidly across the top page. It was the official notice of default and impending foreclosure from the commercial bank regarding the Southside warehouse complex. I spoke clearly, cutting through the heavy, humid air. I told him I had found the floor safe he carelessly left unlocked when he rushed off to his secret wedding. I told him I had secured every single forged commercial loan agreement, every falsified tax return, and every counterfeit notary stamp he had used to steal $650,000 of my equity. I watched the remaining color completely drain from his face, leaving behind a sickly pale gray. His hands began to shake violently, the papers rattling loudly in the quiet street. I informed him that my forensic accountant had already traced the wire transfers to the shadow corporate account he established to fund his pathetic illusion of wealth. I looked at the police officers who were now listening with intense scrutiny, recognizing that they were standing in the middle of a massive federal fraud case. I turned my attention back to my son. I told him that I had permanently suspended every credit card and drained every joint account. I told him that the house was gone, the money was gone, and the protective shield I had provided his entire life was completely permanently shattered. I pointed to the garbage bags resting by his expensive shoes. I told him that was his entire inheritance, and he was completely on his own. I turned my back on him and walked away, leaving him standing on the pavement, clutching the absolute undeniable proof of his own ruin. Vanessa stopped weeping. The absolute silence that followed my declaration hung heavily in the humid air. She slowly walked down the pristine bluestone steps, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the stone. She stopped next to Cameron, looking down at the wrinkled linen shirts spilling from the torn black garbage bag. She looked at the thick stack of legal documents trembling in his hands. She did not understand federal wire fraud or commercial loan defaults, but she understood the word sold, and she understood the word trespassing. Her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. She pointed a manicured finger at me and screamed that I was insane. She yelled that Cameron owned this estate. She declared loudly for the police officers and the neighbors to hear that this house was his wedding gift to her. She claimed Cameron had shown her the official property deed months ago, proving he was a self-made millionaire. I shifted my gaze from my trembling son to his completely delusional wife. I did not feel any pity for Vanessa. She was a willing participant in his fake reality, driven by her own bottomless materialism. I spoke to her with the exact same clinical detachment I used to assess a condemned building. I told Vanessa that she had married a complete illusion. I explained that Cameron had never owned a single square foot of this property. I told her that I purchased this estate 5 years ago entirely in cash through my private holding company. I stated clearly that my son had never paid a mortgage payment. He had never paid the property taxes. He had never even paid the monthly utility bills that kept her custom marble bathtub filled with hot water. He lived here simply because I allowed it, and today that permission was permanently revoked. Vanessa shook her head violently, her oversized sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. She turned to Cameron, grabbing his arm and demanding that he tell me to stop lying. She ordered him to show the police the deed he had shown her. Cameron did not look at her. He could not look at her. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the foreclosure notice, his breathing shallow and rapid. His silence was the most damning confession possible. The pristine image of the wealthy, successful businessman he had projected to her and her status-obsessed parents was rapidly disintegrating right in front of her eyes. I decided to completely demolish whatever small fragments of the illusion remained. I told Vanessa to look closely at the designer clothes spilling out of the garbage bags. I informed her that the custom Italian tuxedo Cameron wore at their secret Napa Valley wedding was paid for by a platinum credit card registered directly to my name. I told her the vintage luxury watch she so proudly flaunted on his wrist was a graduation gift from me. I did not stop there. I explained the exact mechanics of their lavish Bora Bora honeymoon. I told her the first-class plane tickets, the private overwater bungalow, and the expensive tropical cocktails were all funded by the shadow corporate account Cameron used to launder the stolen money out from my commercial warehouse complex. I explained to Vanessa that the heavy diamond engagement ring currently sitting on her finger was likely purchased using the secondary fraudulent loan taken against my small retail strip mall. I told her that every time she bragged to her country club friends about her husband's brilliant real estate investments, she was actually bragging about his ability to perfectly forge my signature on banking documents. I wanted her to feel the full weight of the embarrassment. I wanted her to understand that she was not a victim of circumstance, but a victim of her own blinding greed. If she had ever stopped to ask a single practical question about his business operations, Instead of just spending the money blindly, she might have discovered the truth years ago. But she never asked because she never cared where the money came from, as long as the accounts remained absolutely full. I watched the devastating reality wash over her. Her entire marriage was built on stolen equity and forged signatures. She had bound herself legally and financially to a man who was not a wealthy heir, but a desperate parasite currently facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I told her that the luxury-leased sports car parked at the airport was going to be repossessed by the end of the week because I had completely severed the bank accounts that made the monthly payments. I explained that she was not returning to a life of suburban luxury. She was currently standing on a sidewalk with nothing but the clothes in her suitcases and a husband who was about to be hunted by the federal authorities and the aggressive legal departments of a major commercial bank. Vanessa let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. She physically shoved Cameron away from her. He stumbled backward, dropping the heavy legal documents onto the driveway. The papers scattered across the asphalt, mixing with the dirt and the spilled designer clothing. She yelled at him, demanding to know if anything he had ever told her was actually true. She asked him how he could humiliate her in front of her parents and her wealthy friends. Her concern was not about the massive felonies he had committed or the terrible betrayal of his own father. Her only concern was the immediate catastrophic loss of her social status and her financial security. The neighbors had started to gather at the edges of their manicured lawns, watching the spectacular collapse of the neighborhood golden couple. Cameron had always treated the neighbors with a smug condescension, viewing them as minor characters in his own personal movie. Now those same neighbors were watching him scramble on his hands and knees, picking up dirty shirts while his new wife abandoned him. The sheer humiliation of the moment was absolute. The lead police officer stepped forward, breaking the tense silence. He had heard enough to understand that this was a massive civil and potentially criminal dispute regarding the forged loans, but the immediate issue of the property was definitively resolved. He addressed Cameron and Vanessa directly. He told them that I had provided valid proof of the property sale and that they had absolutely no legal standing to remain on the premises. He ordered them to gather their belongings from the driveway and vacate the area immediately, or they would be placed under arrest for criminal trespassing and disturbing the peace. Cameron fell to his knees on the hard asphalt. He began frantically gathering the scattered legal documents and shoving his wrinkled clothes back into the torn black garbage bags. He looked completely broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had stepped out of the luxury vehicle just 20 minutes ago. Vanessa did not help him. She grabbed the handle of her own heavy leather suitcase and dragged it down the sidewalk, walking entirely away from him. She pulled her cellular phone from her purse, likely dialing her father Howard to demand an immediate rescue. She did not look back at the house or the man she had just married. I stood silently on the sidewalk, watching the absolute destruction of their fake empire. The house was gone. The money was gone. The marriage was instantly fractured. But the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. Cameron stood entirely alone on the sidewalk. The police officers were already returning to their cruisers, having determined the immediate disturbance was over. Vanessa was a distant figure at the end of the block, climbing into a yellow taxi she had hailed with her phone. My son did not chase after her. He did not call out her name. He slowly stood up from the pavement, leaving the torn black garbage bags and the scattered foreclosure documents exactly where they had fallen. He wiped the dirt from the knees of his expensive tailored trousers and turned to face me. The panic that had consumed him just moments ago was entirely gone. It was replaced by a dark, venomous rage that transformed his features. He stepped closer to me, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping under his skin. He did not yell this time. He lowered his voice to a harsh whisper, ensuring the police officers could not hear his threats. He told me I was a dead man. He promised me he would take every single thing I owned and leave me rotting in a state-run nursing home. He said he was going to destroy my life the same way I had just destroyed his. He turned around and walked away, disappearing into the gathering dusk of the suburban neighborhood. I watched him go, knowing this was no longer just a financial dispute over stolen money. It was a fight for absolute survival. I got back into my old truck and drove away, leaving the remnants of his fake life on the curb. The following morning was quiet. I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I had discovered the Instagram photo exactly 2 weeks ago. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over my modest backyard. I was drinking my black coffee and reviewing a secure email on my tablet. Vincent Cole, my forensic accountant, had delivered exactly what he promised. The preliminary tracing report was a masterpiece of financial tracking. It detailed every single illegal transfer Cameron had made from the shadow corporate account over the past 12 months. I had the complete map of his federal wire fraud, printed and neatly stacked next to my coffee mug. The documents proved he had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through offshore accounts before bringing the money back to pay for his luxury cars and the secret destination wedding. I was preparing to call Stephen Gallagher to initiate the final strike and hand the evidence over to the federal authorities when a sharp, aggressive knock at my front door interrupted the silence. I did not receive visitors often, especially not at 7 o'clock in the morning. I walked through the quiet living room and opened the heavy wooden door. A young man in a cheap gray suit stood on my porch holding a thick manila envelope. He looked at me with cold indifference and asked if I was Douglas Montgomery. I confirmed my identity. He thrust the thick envelope directly into my chest, forcing me to take it. He stated clearly that I had been officially served and quickly walked back to his unmarked car parked on the street. He drove away before I even closed the door. I walked back to the kitchen table, setting the heavy envelope down next to my coffee mug. It bore the official seal of the county family court. I sliced the top of the envelope open with a small penknife and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. The title on the first page was printed in bold black letters. It was an emergency ex parte injunction and order of protection. I scanned the petitioner names listed directly below the title: Cameron Montgomery and Howard Lawson. My son had not wasted a single second after leaving the sidewalk last night. He had run straight to his father-in-law, and Howard had immediately unleashed his high-priced corporate legal team to launch a preemptive strike. I read the legal justifications they had submitted to the judge under penalty of perjury. The lies were staggering in their audacity. They claimed that I was suffering from rapid onset dementia and severe cognitive decline. They stated that my recent actions, specifically the abrupt sale of my Oak Brook property and the sudden suspension of all family financial accounts, were clear evidence of erratic, self-destructive behavior. They painted a highly convincing picture of a confused elderly man who was a danger to his own estate and desperately needed immediate legal guardianship to prevent further financial ruin. They argued that I was liquidating assets indiscriminately and hiding the funds, indicating a paranoid mental break. They had weaponized my age against me in the most brutal way possible. Because Cameron was my only living relative, the judge had granted the emergency petition without even hearing my side of the story, pending a full competency hearing scheduled for next month. I flipped to the final page and read the immediate legal orders. The judge had mandated an absolute freeze on all of my personal and corporate assets. The trap had snapped shut with terrifying speed. My primary checking accounts, my retirement funds, my commercial investment portfolios, and the massive cash proceeds from the Oak Brook house sale were completely locked. I could not withdraw a single dollar. I could not pay my utility bills. I could not even write a check to retain Stephen Gallagher to fight this injunction. I reached for my phone and opened my banking application to verify the severity of the order. Every single account balance showed a terrifying zero available balance with a bright red legal hold status blinking next to my name. They had trapped me. Cameron and the Lawsons believed they had completely paralyzed me before I could expose their massive fraud. They thought cutting off my money would force me into submission and allow them to quietly take control of my entire life. They did not realize that an engineer does not need a bank account to expose a structural flaw. They had just escalated the conflict from a civil dispute to a brutal legal war. I looked at the forensic accounting report sitting next to the court order. I was temporarily cut off from my own wealth, but I still possessed the absolute truth, and I was ready to use their own momentum to bring their entire house of cards crashing down. I stared at the red warning banner glowing on my tablet screen. The words "account frozen" stared back at me with cold indifference. I needed to know the absolute physical limits of the legal cage my son had just dropped over me. An application interface can sometimes lag or misrepresent the full scope of a court order. I needed to speak to a human being to understand exactly how tight the snare had been pulled. I gathered the court documents and the forensic accounting report, sliding them carefully into my heavy leather work bag. I picked up my keys and walked out the front door, locking it firmly behind me. I climbed into my old truck and drove toward the main branch of my commercial bank located in the center of the financial district. The drive was tense and uncharacteristically slow. My fuel gauge was hovering dangerously near the quarter tank mark. For the first time in over 40 years, I had to seriously consider if I could afford the gas to drive back home. It was a bizarre, disorienting feeling. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously building a financial fortress to ensure I would never experience the bitter sting of poverty again. Now my own son had used the legal system to lock me outside the gates of that very fortress. I pulled into the polished parking lot of the bank. This was the massive institution where I had deposited the $2 million proceeds of the Oak Brook estate sale just a few days ago. I walked through the heavy glass doors into the quiet, air-conditioned lobby. I did not go to the standard teller line where I would be treated like a routine customer. I walked directly to the mahogany desk of the branch manager, a man named Gregory, who had personally handled my complex business accounts for over a decade. Gregory looked up from his dual computer monitors. When he saw me approaching, his professional, welcoming smile immediately vanished. It was replaced by a look of deep, profound discomfort and nervous apprehension. He stood up quickly, straightening his tie, and asked me in a hushed voice to step into his private office. I followed him into the small glass-walled room. He closed the heavy door, completely shutting out the ambient noise of the busy bank lobby. He did not offer me a comfortable seat. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and strict legal caution. I placed my hands flat on the polished surface of his desk and asked him to explain the exact current status of my liquid assets and corporate holdings. Gregory swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. He explained that a county sheriff deputy had personally delivered the emergency court order less than an hour ago. He told me that the bank corporate legal department had immediately reviewed the injunction and forcibly complied with the judge mandates. Every single account attached to my social security number and my corporate tax identification was completely locked down. The operating capital for my property management company, the high-yield savings accounts, my retirement portfolios, and the massive cash deposit from the recent house sale were all entirely inaccessible. I asked him if there was any legal allowance for basic living expenses or emergency legal retainer fees. Gregory shook his head, looking down at his polished shoes, unable to maintain eye contact. He explained that the court order specifically cited severe cognitive decline and named my son Cameron as the sole emergency financial conservator. The bank could not release a single dollar to me without Cameron explicit written authorization. The sheer malicious brilliance of their strategy became absolutely clear in that small glass office. They had not just temporarily taken my money, they had weaponized my own wealth against me and handed the absolute control panel directly to the man who was actively robbing me. I pulled my premium platinum credit card from my leather wallet and placed it flat on the mahogany desk. I asked Gregory if the credit lines were also suspended under the court order. He nodded slowly, confirming that the credit card issuer had received the exact same automated legal notice and terminated all purchasing power. I was holding a piece of useless heavy plastic. I picked the card back up and slid it into my pocket. I did not raise my voice or argue with the branch manager. I knew he was simply a mechanical gear inside the massive banking institution blindly following the rigid rules of legal compliance. Getting angry at him or causing a scene in the lobby would only reinforce the false narrative that I was an unstable, erratic old man losing his grip on reality. I thanked Gregory for his time maintaining my composure and walked out of the glass office. I crossed the lobby feeling the heavy eyes of the bank employees watching me. They had likely been briefed on the sensitive situation by the management team. To them, I was no longer the sharp, successful structural engineer who had built a massive real estate portfolio through sheer grit and intelligence. I was a tragic figure, a confused elderly man whose mind was rapidly failing him, requiring the drastic intervention of his caring son. The humiliation burned hot and deep in my chest, but I forced it down, locking it away behind a massive wall of cold calculation. I walked out of the heavy glass doors and stepped back into the bright morning sun, feeling the weight of my new reality. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck and pulled my wallet from my pocket one more time. I pulled out the physical currency I had on hand and counted it slowly. I had exactly $47 in loose cash. That was the absolute sum total of my available purchasing power in the entire world. A man who had millions of dollars in liquid equity just yesterday was now reduced to counting crumpled bills in a bank parking lot. Cameron and Howard Lawson had successfully executed a perfect financial chokehold. They expected me to panic under the sudden immense pressure. They expected me to call them begging for a meager allowance to buy groceries or pay my electric bill. Most importantly, they expected me to surrender the heavy plastic folder containing the undeniable evidence of their federal wire fraud in exchange for regaining access to my own retirement funds. I started the truck engine, watching the low fuel light flicker dimly on the dashboard. They had severely underestimated the fundamental nature of the man they were attacking. An engineer does not panic when a complex system fails. He isolates the broken component, assesses the remaining functional tools, and builds a necessary bypass. They had successfully taken my money, but they had not taken my mind, and they certainly had not taken my evidence. I did not need a functioning bank account to completely destroy them. I only needed a lawyer who operated with the same ruthless precision I did. I put the truck into gear and pulled out of the parking lot, merging into the heavy city traffic. I was not going home to sit in the dark and admit defeat. I was driving straight to the corporate office of Stephen Gallagher. I was going to drop the forensic accounting report directly on his desk and initiate the total systematic demolition of my son and his incredibly arrogant in-laws. I drove my truck into the underground parking garage of the towering glass and steel building that housed Stephen Gallagher and his team of corporate litigators. I walked past the security desk with the quiet confidence of a man who owned the building, even though my pockets contained exactly $47. I rode the silent elevator to the 42nd floor. The receptionist recognized me immediately and guided me directly to Stephen corner off of office overlooking the sprawling city skyline. Stephen was standing behind his massive oak desk, holding a printed copy of the exact same court order that had been shoved into my chest an hour ago. He looked deeply concerned. He started speaking before I even sat down. He told me the laws surrounding emergency conservatorships were incredibly aggressive and designed to act first and ask questions later. He explained that we would need to hire independent medical experts to evaluate my cognitive health and petition the court for an emergency hearing to lift the freeze on my assets. He told me it could take weeks of defensive legal maneuvering just to regain access to my primary checking accounts. I listened to his defensive strategy in complete silence. When he finished speaking, I sat down in the heavy leather chair opposite his desk. I opened my weathered work bag and pulled out the thick plastic folder. I dropped it onto the polished wood surface. The heavy slap of the plastic echoed in the quiet room. I looked my attorney directly in the eye and told him we were not going to play defense. I told him I refused to spend a single second trying to prove my sanity to a judge who had already decided I was broken. I explained that an engineer does not argue with a failing structural column. He removes the column completely. I told Stephen to open the folder. He picked up the plastic envelope and slid the contents onto his desk. He looked at the forensic accounting report first. His eyes scanned the precise columns of numbers, the offshore routing codes, and the documented wire transfers mapping out the stolen $650,000. Then he looked at the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the forged commercial loan documents from Cameron unlocked floor safe. I watched the profound concern on Stephen's face evaporate. It was instantly replaced by the sharp, cold focus of a legal predator who had just been handed a loaded weapon. He traced his finger over the flawless forgery of my signature. He looked up at me, his voice entirely changed. He asked me if the bank had been notified about the fraudulent loans yet. I told him the bank knew absolutely nothing. I told him we held the only copy of the truth, and it was time to detonate it. I laid out the exact parameters of the counter-strike. I told Stephen we were not going to fight the dementia claim in family court. We were going to obliterate Cameron credibility in criminal court. I instructed him to immediately draft a massive civil suit against my son and his new wife for grand larceny and severe elder financial abuse. But the civil suit was only the first layer of the attack. I told Stephen to take the forensic report and the photographic evidence directly to his contacts at the district attorney office, specifically the division handling major white-collar crimes. I wanted Cameron charged with federal wire fraud and bank fraud before the sun went down. Stephen leaned back in his chair, tapping his expensive pen against the desk. He smiled a tight, ruthless smile. He explained the legal brilliance of this aggressive maneuver. If we proved to a criminal court that Cameron was actively stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from my estate, the family court judge would be forced to immediately dissolve the emergency conservatorship. A federal judge would never allow an indicted fraudster to maintain absolute financial control over his victim. The dementia claim would be instantly exposed as a malicious smokescreen designed to cover up a massive felony. We would shatter their legal cage from the outside in. Stephen brought up the issue of financing this legal war. He reminded me that his firm required a substantial retainer for a case of this magnitude, and all of my assets were currently frozen solid by the court order. I did not blink. I told him to place a lien against the unencumbered commercial property I owned on the north side of the city. I told him he could take whatever percentage he needed once the dust settled and my accounts were unlocked. Stephen waved his hand, dismissing the concern entirely. He had represented me for over a decade, and he knew the absolute strength of my portfolio. More importantly, he looked at the evidence on his desk and knew this was a guaranteed victory. He told me he would float the legal costs himself because he wanted the personal satisfaction of watching Howard Lawson's expensive legal team get completely humiliated in open court. The mention of Howard Lawson shifted my focus to the next logical step in the equation. I looked at the emergency injunction sitting on the edge of the desk. Cameron was incredibly arrogant, but he was not intelligent enough to execute a preemptive legal strike of this magnitude. He did not know how to navigate the complex family court system or secure an ex parte order of protection in less than 12 hours. This entire strategy had the greasy fingerprints of his new father-in-law all over it. Howard Lawson was the architect of the dementia claim. Howard had paid the exorbitant legal fees to file the petition, and Howard was actively shielding Cameron from the fallout of the destroyed wedding gift. I stood up from the leather chair. I felt a surge of cold, calculating energy running through my veins. The trap they had set for me had just become their own prison. I told Stephen to file the papers and make the calls to the district attorney immediately. But I also gave him one final directive before I left the office. I told him to hire a private investigative firm to look deep into the business dealings of Howard Lawson. If Howard wanted to use his wealth to fund a war against me, I needed to know exactly how strong his fortress actually was. I walked out of the law office, leaving the heavy folder of evidence behind. I still only had $47 in my pocket, but I was no longer a victim trapped in a corner. I was a man who had just launched a devastating counteroffensive, and the parasites who tried to bleed me dry were about to learn the true cost of their greed. I drove away from the towering glass building and headed toward a small, fading diner on the edge of the industrial district. I had exactly $47 in my pocket, and I needed a quiet place to eat and gather my thoughts. I parked my old truck in the cracked asphalt lot and walked inside. The diner smelled like old coffee and fried onions. It was the kind of place where working men ate in silence. I sat in a vinyl booth near the back window and ordered a simple black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs. I placed a $10 bill on the sticky table waiting for my food. I was drinking my coffee watching the heavy truck traffic roll by outside when a sleek silver luxury sedan pulled into the parking lot. The car looked completely absurd, parked next to the rusted pickup trucks and fading sedans. I watched as the driver door opened and Howard Lawson stepped out into the afternoon heat. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that likely cost more than the entire monthly rent of this restaurant. He adjusted his silk tie and looked at the greasy front door with obvious disgust before pulling it open. He did not have to search the room for me. He walked directly toward my booth in the back. He must have paid a private investigator to follow my truck from the bank to the law office, and finally to this diner. Howard slid into the vinyl seat across from me without asking for permission or offering a greeting. He placed his expensive leather briefcase on the table, pushing my salt and pepper shakers out of the way to claim the space. He looked at my plate of cheap food arriving and let out a short, arrogant laugh. He told me I looked exactly like a man who had just lost everything. I did not stop eating. I took a bite of my food and looked at him calmly. Howard leaned forward, resting his manicured hands on the table. The smug satisfaction on his face was radiating across the small booth. He told me he had just received a very frantic phone call from his corporate lawyers. He said he knew about the ridiculous criminal complaints Stephen Gallagher had just filed with the district attorney. Howard shook his head, pretending to be deeply disappointed in my actions. He told me I was making a massive, irreversible mistake. He said I was an old man throwing a temper tantrum and that I had absolutely no idea who I was dealing with. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. He boasted that his legal team was the most aggressive and expensive firm in the state. He told me they routinely crushed small-time corporate lawyers like Stephen before breakfast. Howard spoke with the blinding arrogance of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his entire life. He told me that the emergency conservatorship was completely airtight and perfectly executed. He reminded me that he currently held the signature of a family court judge, freezing every single penny to my name. He told me he could drag this legal battle out for years. He promised to file endless motions requesting psychiatric evaluations and mandatory competency hearings until I was entirely bankrupt and living on the street. He looked around the cheap diner and sneered, telling me I should get used to this kind of environment because it was my permanent new reality. He said he was going to make sure my son retained absolute control over my estate and that I would spend my final years begging them for a weekly allowance just to buy basic groceries. Then he offered me his version of a compromise. It was an incredibly insulting display of fake mercy. Howard opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the sticky table toward me. He told me it was a legally binding settlement agreement. He instructed me to call my attorney right now and drop all the criminal charges against Cameron and Vanessa. In exchange, he promised to have Cameron petition the family court to lift the asset freeze. But there was a massive condition attached to this false generosity. The agreement stated that I would officially transfer the title of the Southside warehouse complex directly to Cameron to secure his financial future. Howard smiled, telling me it was a very small price to pay to get my life back. He told me to sign the paper, swallow my pride, and go back to my quiet retirement before things got truly ugly for me. I looked at the piece of paper sitting next to my coffee mug. I did not touch it. I looked up at Howard Lawson. I did not see a powerful, wealthy patriarch. I saw a desperate man projecting a hollow illusion of strength. If his legal team was truly invincible, He would not have tracked me down to a greasy diner to force a settlement less than 2 hours after we filed the criminal charges. He was terrified. He knew that if the district attorney opened a massive federal wire fraud investigation, the subsequent financial audit would eventually bleed into his own business dealings and expose his own secrets. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I set the mug down and told Howard exactly what I thought of his generous offer. I told him he was standing on a highly unstable foundation, and he was too arrogant to feel the ground shaking beneath his feet. I explained that an engineer knows how to identify a load-bearing wall. In his family structure, his supposed massive wealth was the only thing holding up his authority. I told him I refused to sign his pathetic document. I told him the criminal charges were permanent, and the forensic evidence of his son-in-law committing federal fraud was already in the hands of the authorities. I promised him that Cameron was going to a federal penitentiary and his precious daughter would be left with absolutely nothing. Howard's face turned a deep, mottled red. His smug smile completely vanished, replaced by raw, aggressive anger. He slammed his hand flat on the table, rattling my coffee mug and spilling dark liquid onto the vinyl. He told me I was a foolish old man who was digging his own grave. He threatened to completely destroy my legacy and leave me rotting in a state-run medical facility. He stood up violently, grabbing his briefcase and the unsigned settlement document. He glared at me one last time, promising that I would deeply regret this day for the rest of my short life. He turned around and marched out of the diner, the bell on the front door jingling cheerfully behind him. I watched through this dirty window as he climbed back into his luxury sedan and sped out of the parking lot, leaving a trail of exhaust. I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over me. Howard thought he was intimidating me, but he had just given me the exact confirmation I needed. His frantic need to silence me proved that he had massive vulnerabilities he was desperately trying to hide. I finished my breakfast and left the $10 bill on the table. The private investigators were already digging into his financial records, and I was entirely confident that what they found would give me the exact leverage I needed to demolish his entire fake empire. I drove my truck back to my modest house, feeling the heavy afternoon heat radiating from the pavement. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. The confrontation at the diner had confirmed every single suspicion I held regarding the father-in-law of my son. Howard Lawson was a man drowning in his own manufactured reality, desperately trying to drag my legitimate wealth into his sinking ship. I unlocked my front door and walked into the quiet coolness of my living room. I placed my keys on the small wooden table in the hallway and walked directly to my study. The red warning banner was still active on my banking application, locking me out of my entire financial history, but my mind was completely free and moving with the relentless precision of a high-speed turbine. I sat down in my heavy leather chair and opened my laptop computer. Less than 10 minutes later, my cellular phone began to vibrate against the polished wood of my desk. It was a secure, encrypted call from Vincent Cole. My forensic accountant had spent the last 4 hours coordinating with the private investigative firm Stephen Gallagher had retained on my behalf. I answered the call and put Vincent on the speaker function. I did not ask for pleasantries. I told him I needed to know exactly what was holding up the massive financial facade of Howard Lawson. Vincent's voice was crisp and entirely devoid of emotion as he began to dismantle the illusion of the wealthy patriarch. He told me that Howard was a financial ghost playing an incredibly dangerous corporate shell game. The sprawling luxury estate where Howard and his wife Diane hosted their extravagant dinner parties was not a fully owned asset. Vincent explained that the property was heavily leveraged with 3 separate high-interest mortgages, and Howard was currently 60 days behind on the primary payment. The luxury vehicles they leased were registered to a failing subsidiary company that was actively being sued by multiple creditors for unpaid debts. Howard was completely drowning in liabilities, constantly moving small amounts of cash between offshore accounts and obscure corporate entities just to avoid defaulting and triggering a massive federal bankruptcy. I listened to the steady rhythm of Vincent reporting these facts and felt a cold sense of satisfaction. Howard had sat across from me in that cheap diner wearing a custom-tailored suit, while his entire life was a house of cards waiting for a strong gust of wind. But Vincent cautioned me that there was one significant anomaly in the financial structure. Despite the massive debt and the failing subsidiary companies, Howard managed to secure one incredibly large influx of cash on the first day of every single month. It was a massive corporate disbursement that provided just enough liquid capital to cover his minimum debt payments and keep his country club memberships active. Vincent told me he had just emailed the secure documents detailing the origin of this monthly payment. I opened my email client and downloaded the heavily encrypted file. I entered the password Vincent provided and opened the digital folder. The screen filled with complex corporate tax filings and commercial vendor agreements. I asked Vincent to summarize the primary source of the income, while I scanned the dense legal text. Vincent explained that Howard owned a regional materials supply company that had recently secured a highly lucrative municipal contract. Howard was supplying specialized industrial foundation materials for a massive commercial development project on the east side of the county. The monthly cash disbursement was the vendor payment from the primary development firm overseeing the massive infrastructure build. I stopped scrolling through the document. I looked at the name of the primary development firm listed at the top of the vendor contract. The name printed in bold black letters was Apex Development Partners. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. A deep, resonant sense of absolute victory settled into my bones. Apex Development Partners was not a random, faceless corporation to me. For 15 years before my retirement, I had served as their primary structural engineering consultant. I had personally designed the load-bearing foundations for half of their commercial skyscrapers. I knew their entire executive board. More importantly, I personally knew their chief executive officer, a man named Gordon Mitchell, who valued structural integrity and corporate honesty above absolutely everything else. I leaned closer to the computer screen, my eyes scanning the technical requirements attached to the vendor contract Howard had signed. To win a municipal supply contract of that massive magnitude, a vendor was legally required to submit rigorous technical certifications and independent stress test data proving their materials could handle the massive physical burdens of commercial construction. I opened the supplementary file containing the technical submissions Howard had provided to Apex Development Partners. I zoomed in on the scanned engineering stamps and the signed inspection reports. I spent 40 years looking at structural blueprints and material safety certifications. I knew exactly what a legitimate stress test report looked like. I stared at the documents on my screen, and the absolute brilliant irony of the situation washed over me. The engineering stamps on Howard's submissions were completely fraudulent. The signature of the authorizing inspector was a crude digital manipulation. Howard had falsified the structural integrity reports to secure the massive municipal contract because his actual supply materials were cheap substandard garbage that would never pass a legitimate safety inspection. He had committed massive corporate fraud that actively endangered public safety simply to secure the cash flow necessary to maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. I leaned back in my leather chair and let out a long, slow breath. Howard had filed a malicious injunction claiming I was mentally incompetent, attempting to steal my legitimate wealth using a corrupt family court maneuver. He thought his expensive corporate lawyers made him invincible. He thought he could bully an old man in a diner and walk away without a scratch. He was completely wrong. I did not need a team of expensive lawyers to completely destroy Howard Lawson. I did not need access to my frozen bank accounts to bring his entire world crashing down. I only needed my reputation and my oldest professional contacts. I picked up my cellular phone and disconnected the call with Vincent Cole, thanking him for his flawless execution. I opened my personal contact list and scrolled down until I found the private cellular number for Gordon Mitchell. Howard was currently standing on a massive financial landmine, and he was completely unaware that I was holding the detonator. By tomorrow morning, He was not only going to lose the single contract keeping him out of bankruptcy, but he was going to face severe criminal charges for submitting fraudulent engineering documents to a massive municipal project. The trap he had built for me had completely reversed its polarity. I pressed the call button and listened to the phone ring, preparing to completely dismantle the father-in-law of my son. The sound of the phone ringing in my quiet study felt like a slow, deliberate countdown. Gordon Mitchell was not a man who answered unknown numbers, but he had kept my private contact saved in his personal directory for over 15 years. He picked up on the third ring. His voice was deep and commanding, the voice of a man accustomed to directing thousands of workers and moving billions of dollars in steel and concrete. He recognized my name instantly. He expressed genuine pleasure at hearing from me, asking if my quiet retirement was treating me well. I did not return the polite pleasantries. I told him my retirement had been violently interrupted, and I needed to cash in the professional favor he had owed me since the Downtown Plaza project in 2008. The tone of Gordon's voice shifted immediately. He knew I was a man who never asked for favors. He remembered that I had saved his firm from a massive structural failure by catching a critical flaw in a subterranean load-bearing wall. He told me to name whatever I needed. I asked him about the massive municipal infrastructure project his firm was currently building on the east side of the county. I asked him specifically about his primary vendor for the industrial foundation materials. Gordon confirmed the details without hesitation. He stated the vendor was a regional supply company owned by a man named Howard Lawson. Gordon mentioned the materials were arriving on schedule, and the early phases of the concrete pour were moving forward smoothly. I told him the pour needed to stop immediately. I told him every single cubic yard of concrete resting on those foundation materials was structurally compromised. The line went completely silent. In the world of high-stakes commercial development, telling a chief executive officer that his foundation is compromised is the exact equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater. Gordon demanded to know exactly what I meant. I explained that I had just spent the last hour reviewing the technical certifications and the independent stress test data Howard Lawson had submitted to win the vendor contract. I told Gordon those documents were entirely fabricated. I told him the engineering stamps verifying the load-bearing capacities were crude digital forgeries. Howard was supplying cheap, substandard materials that would inevitably buckle and fail under the massive weight of the completed commercial structures. Gordon did not argue with me. He did not attempt to defend his chosen vendor. He knew my 40-year reputation for absolute structural precision. He simply asked me if I had the physical proof. I told him I had already forwarded the encrypted file to his private email address while the phone was ringing. I heard the sharp, rapid clicking of his computer keyboard, followed by a heavy, exhausted sigh. Gordon was looking at the fraudulent documents. He saw the fake signatures and the manipulated data points clearly displayed on his screen. He realized instantly that Howard Lawson had not just defrauded Apex Development Partners. Howard had exposed the entire development firm to catastrophic legal liability and potential criminal negligence charges if those buildings ever collapsed and cost human lives. The anger in Gordon's voice was cold and absolute. He did not raise his voice, but the intense fury of his words vibrated through the phone speaker. He told me that he was shutting down the East Side construction site within the hour to initiate an emergency structural review of the materials already placed. He told me he was calling his corporate legal team to immediately void the vendor contract with Howard Lawson due to gross material fraud and breach of safety protocols. He assured me that Howard would not receive another single dollar from the municipal project. Furthermore, Gordon promised that Apex Development Partners would be handing the forged documents over to the federal authorities and filing severe criminal complaints with the state licensing board before the end of the business day. I thanked Gordon for his swift and decisive action. He told me I had just saved his company from a billion-dollar disaster, and the favor from 2008 was officially repaid in full. I ended the call and placed the phone back on my polished wooden desk. The massive leverage had been successfully applied. Howard Lawson had attempted to use the family court system to trap me in a cage of financial ruin. I had simply used the undeniable truth to completely obliterate the single fragile pillar holding up his entire pathetic existence. The phone call took exactly 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, the fraudulent wealth of my son's father-in-law was permanently erased. The morning sun brought with it the absolute destruction of the Lawson family. I sat in my study drinking my black coffee and waiting for the inevitable shockwave to reach me. It did not take long. At precisely 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Vincent Cole. He did not say good morning. He simply stated that the dominoes were falling significantly faster than even he had predicted. Gordon Mitchell had kept his word with ruthless efficiency. By 8 o'clock, Gordon had formally terminated the massive vendor contract with Howard Lawson. But Gordon did not stop at a simple termination. He had his corporate attorneys deliver the forged engineering documents directly to the district attorney and the municipal licensing board. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. A municipal infrastructure project is heavily scrutinized, and the sudden revelation of fraudulent load-bearing materials triggered an immediate financial panic across the city. Vincent told me that the news had already leaked to the primary commercial lenders holding the massive debt on Howard failing subsidiary companies. When a banking institution discovers their debtor is facing severe federal fraud charges and the absolute loss of their only lucrative contract, they do not hesitate. They execute their emergency clauses without an ounce of mercy. Vincent painted a vivid, detailed picture of the financial bloodbath currently happening across town. The primary bank holding the 3 high-interest mortgages on Howard's sprawling luxury estate had just filed an immediate notice of default. They cited the active criminal investigation as a direct violation of the loan terms and demanded full payment of the outstanding balance within 24 hours. Howard obviously did not have the liquid cash to satisfy the demand. He was completely bankrupt. The bank immediately moved to seize the property to protect their investment. The collapse did not stop at the residential real estate. Vincent explained that the aggressive creditors who had been circling Howard failing businesses for months finally saw the blood in the water. They secured emergency court orders to freeze every single corporate account associated with his name. The luxury leased vehicles that Howard and Diane drove to their expensive country club dinners were actively being repossessed. Vincent told me his private investigators were currently watching a commercial tow truck back into the Lawson driveway to remove the silver luxury sedan. The same sedan Howard had driven to the diner yesterday to threaten me. Diane Lawson was standing on her front porch screaming at the men, while the wealthy neighbors she had spent years looking down upon watched the humiliating spectacle from their manicured lawns. Howard had spent his entire adult life projecting a flawless image of untouchable generational wealth. He had used that fake image to intimidate people, to secure fraudulent loans, and to bully an old man into giving up his life savings. Now that carefully constructed image was completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. He was no longer a powerful, wealthy patriarch. He was a desperate, exposed criminal who could not even afford to hire a taxi to flee his own foreclosed home. The most critical piece of this total collapse was the immediate legal implication for my own situation. Howard had funded the highly expensive corporate lawyers who filed the fake dementia injunction against me. He had paid their massive retainers using the stolen money from his fraudulent business practices. Vincent confirmed that the aggressive law firm had just completely dropped Howard and Cameron as clients. Corporate litigators do not work for free, and they certainly do not represent men whose bank accounts have been entirely frozen by federal fraud investigators. Without Howard and his expensive legal team, my son Cameron was completely exposed. The massive protective shield of fake wealth they had used to terrorize me had evaporated in less than 24 hours. The ex parte order freezing my assets was still technically active on paper, but the men who filed it were now entirely destitute and facing their own massive criminal indictments. They had absolutely no financial resources left to fight me in family court. I thanked Vincent for the comprehensive update and ended the phone call. The financial war was officially over. Howard Lawson was completely destroyed by his own blinding arrogance. The foundation of their greedy alliance had crumbled to dust, leaving only the final inevitable collision with my desperate son. The afternoon passed in absolute quiet. I remained in my study organizing the final pieces of forensic evidence Vincent Cole had prepared for the federal authorities. The massive financial collapse of the Lawson family was already dominating the local business news networks. I was watching a silent television broadcast showing the seized luxury vehicles being towed away from Howard foreclosed estate when my cellular phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed a local number I did not recognize. I answered the call and brought the phone to my ear. I did not speak. I simply waited for the caller to declare themselves. The sound of heavy, ragged breathing filled the line. Then I heard the broken, trembling voice of my son. Cameron was not calling to threaten me this time. The dark, venomous rage he had displayed on the sidewalk yesterday was completely gone, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. He told me he was calling from a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. He explained that his premium credit cards were still declining every transaction, and Vanessa's parents were entirely unreachable. He said he had tried to go to Howard House, but the property was surrounded by bank representatives and private security guards. He was completely trapped with no money, no shelter, and the terrifying reality felt of federal fraud charges closing in on him. Cameron begged me to lift the legal freeze on his checking accounts. He pleaded with me to wire him just a few $1,000s so he could hire a basic defense attorney and find a permanent place to stay. He promised he would pay me back every single penny he had stolen from the commercial warehouse loans. He swore he would sign any document I wanted if I just showed him a shred of mercy. I sat in my leather chair listening to his pathetic desperation. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no regret. I was about to tell him that his fate was no longer in my hands when a sharp, violent crash echoed through the phone line. It sounded like a glass lamp shattering against a wall. Then I heard Vanessa. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged. She was not crying anymore. She was screaming with the primal fury of a woman who had just watched her entire manufactured future burn to the ground. She demanded to know who Cameron was talking to. When he quietly admitted he was begging me for money, Vanessa completely lost her mind. She yelled loud enough for the phone microphone to capture every single word with perfect clarity. She called him a pathetic fraud. She screamed that he was not a wealthy, successful businessman, but a desperate criminal who had ruined her life. Cameron frantically tried to silence her, begging her to lower her voice and remember that they were a team. His desperate pleas only fueled her rage. Vanessa laughed, a cold, cruel sound that pierced through the phone line. She told him there was never a team. She admitted with brutal honesty that she had only endured his arrogant personality and his boring stories because she genuinely believed he owned the $2 million Oak Brook estate. She screamed that the only reason she wore his ring and smiled for his fake Instagram photos was the promise of my massive trust fund. She told him she had married a bank account, and since the account was permanently closed, the marriage was officially over. I listened to the sound of zippers being violently pulled closed and heavy suitcases being dragged across a cheap carpet. Cameron was openly sobbing now, begging her not to walk out the door. He told her he loved her and that they could rebuild everything if she just stayed with him. Vanessa told him he was going to federal prison and she absolutely refused to be the wife of a convicted felon. The heavy motel door slammed shut with a definitive, thunderous crack, completely severing their fraudulent union. Cameron was left entirely alone in the cheap motel room. He wept into the phone, calling my name, asking me what he was supposed to do now. His wife had abandoned him. His father-in-law was bankrupt and facing his own criminal indictments. His fake life was entirely dismantled. I did not offer him any comfort. I did not give him any advice. I told him he should probably pack whatever wrinkled clothes he had left in those black garbage bags because the federal authorities would be arriving very soon. I pressed the red button, and ended the call, leaving him in absolute silence. The pressure had perfectly crushed the diamond of their fake marriage, turning it back into worthless dust. The clock in my hallway chimed 2 times. It was the absolute dead of night, and my neighborhood was wrapped in complete silence. I was sitting in the dark of my living room, awake and fully dressed. I had not gone to sleep because I knew the psychological pressure I had applied to my son would eventually force a violent physical reaction. An animal trapped in a corner does not simply lie down and accept defeat. It lashes out blindly at the nearest perceived threat. I was the architect of his current misery. I had systematically dismantled his marriage, his finances, and his fake social standing. I knew with absolute certainty that he would inevitably come looking for me. I sat in my favorite armchair facing the large front window. I did not have the interior lights turned on. I was entirely concealed by the heavy shadows of the room. I watched the street outside, illuminated only by the pale yellow glow of the municipal street lamps. The heavy silence was finally broken by the harsh sound of a struggling engine. A rusted, faded sedan turned the corner at a reckless speed. It was definitely not a luxury leased sports car. It was the kind of cheap, disposable vehicle you rent with loose cash when your premium platinum credit cards are completely frozen by a court order. The car swerved aggressively before slamming hard into the curb directly in front of my house. The engine choked and died, leaving a thick cloud of dark exhaust drifting slowly into the humid night air. The driver door violently pushed open, and a man stepped out onto the quiet street. It was Cameron. He was a terrifying hollow shadow of the arrogant man who had stood on the pristine bluestone driveway just 2 days ago. He was no longer wearing custom-tailored linen trousers or a crisp white designer shirt. He wore a dark hooded sweatshirt and stained denim jeans. His posture was completely broken. He staggered as he walked toward my property, moving with the erratic, unpredictable energy of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. His materialistic wife had abandoned him in a cheap motel. His fraudulent father-in-law was bankrupt and facing his own indictments. The federal authorities were actively preparing his arrest warrants for massive wire fraud. The blinding illusion of his wealth was gone, and only the desperate, dangerous criminal remained. I watched him cross my front lawn, trampling heavily over the carefully manicured flower beds I had planted last spring. He did not walk up the concrete pathway. He moved aggressively straight toward the front door. I could see the faint glint of the streetlight catching on a heavy metallic object gripped tightly in his right hand. It was a large tire iron likely pulled from the dark trunk of the cheap rental car. He was not coming to beg for my forgiveness or ask for a second chance. He was coming to extract my legal compliance through raw physical intimidation. He truly believed he could force me to call Stephen Gallagher and the federal prosecutors to drop the massive fraud charges. He believed he could beat the truth out of me and force me to rebuild the financial cage he had constructed. Cameron stopped at the bottom of my porch steps. He looked up at the dark, silent windows of my house, his chest heaving heavily. I could hear his ragged, shallow breathing through the thick structural glass. He raised the heavy iron bar and struck the wooden railing of my porch. The violent wooden crack shattered the peaceful quiet of the suburban night. He did not shout my name. He did not scream his demands into the darkness. He simply hit the wood again, harder this time, sending wooden splinters flying onto the grass. The absolute silence of his rage made it infinitely more dangerous. He was completely unhinged, operating purely on the toxic adrenaline of absolute ruin. I remained perfectly still in my dark armchair. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or parental regret. I had spent my entire professional career anticipating catastrophic structural failures and preparing absolute contingencies for every possible disaster. I knew Cameron was coming, and I had prepared my house accordingly. I reached into my jacket pocket and touched the small remote control device resting against my leg. The entire perimeter of my property was wired with high-definition security cameras, equipped with advanced infrared night vision capabilities. Every single violent swing of his iron bar, every aggressive step he took on my property, was currently being recorded in flawless high resolution and transmitted directly to a secure remote cloud server. He thought he was bringing a private war to my doorstep in the dead of night to terrorize an old man. He did not realize he was simply walking onto a perfectly lit digital stage to perform his final undeniable criminal act for the federal prosecutors. I took a deep, silent breath and waited for him to take the final heavy step onto my porch. The heavy iron bar smashed through the glass panes of my front door with a deafening crash. Shards of broken glass scattered across the hardwood floor of my hallway, reflecting the pale yellow light from the street lamps outside. Cameron reached his hand through the jagged hole, ignoring the sharp edges that tore at the sleeve of his dark sweatshirt. He fumbled for the deadbolt, turned the heavy brass latch, and pushed the door open. He stepped over the threshold, bringing the humid night air and the heavy metallic smell of the iron bar into my home. He stood in the entryway, his chest heaving, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. He did not know I was sitting less than 15 feet away from him, perfectly still in my leather armchair. I reached over to the small wooden side table and twisted the switch on my reading lamp. A warm circle of light instantly illuminated my section of the living room, casting long, deep shadows against the walls. Cameron flinched at the sudden light, bringing the tire iron up defensively. When he saw me sitting calmly with my hands resting flat on the armrests, his defensive posture morphed back into aggressive rage. He marched into the living room, his boots crunching loudly over the broken glass he had tracked onto the rug. He stopped just outside the circle of light, gripping the iron bar so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He pointed the heavy metal weapon directly at my chest. His voice was raw and completely unhinged, tearing through the quiet room. He told me to pick up my cellular phone right now. He ordered me to call Stephen Gallagher and the federal prosecutors. He demanded that I tell them the entire investigation was a massive misunderstanding and that I had authorized those commercial loans myself. He said if I did not make the phone calls immediately, he was going to start smashing every single piece of furniture in my house. He threatened to break my legs and leave me bleeding on the floor until I gave him exactly what he wanted. I did not reach for my phone. I did not move a single muscle. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and spoke in a clear, steady voice, ensuring the hidden microphones mounted in the ceiling captured every single syllable. I asked him to clarify his demands. I asked him if he was actively threatening to cause me severe bodily harm with a deadly weapon, unless I lied to federal authorities about the $650,000 he stole from my commercial properties. I wanted his extortion attempt documented with absolute undeniable precision. Cameron let out a desperate, manic laugh. He stepped closer, crossing into the light of the reading lamp. The high-definition camera hidden in the bookshelf behind me captured his face perfectly. He screamed that I owed him that money. He yelled that he deserved the house and the luxury cars because he had to endure my pathetic, boring life for 32 years. He openly admitted to the forgery right there in my living room. He bragged about how easy it was to copy my signature and trick the commercial bank. He said I was a foolish old man who was too blind to see what was happening right in front of him. He raised the tire iron high above his head, the heavy metal casting a long, dark shadow across the ceiling. He told me this was my absolute final warning. He said he would count to 3, and if I did not have the phone against my ear, he was going to swing the bar. I looked at the heavy iron weapon hovering above me. I felt the slow, steady beat of my own heart. I did not flinch. I told him he did not need to count. I told him I was not going to make a single phone call to protect him. I explained that an engineer builds systems with multiple layers of redundancy to ensure absolute security. I told him my security system was not designed to keep people out. It was designed to perfectly capture what they did once they broke in. I looked up at the small black lens hidden in the corner molding of the ceiling. I told Cameron to look at the small blinking red light. I told him that every single threat he just made, every admission of federal fraud, and his violent entry into my home had just been recorded and transmitted directly to the private servers of my corporate attorney. Cameron froze. The heavy iron bar remained suspended in the air. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching the dark corners and the ceiling moldings. He saw the small red lights blinking silently in the shadows. The terrifying reality of his situation crashed over him. He had not cornered a helpless old man. He had just voluntarily walked into a perfectly designed digital trap and confessed to multiple massive felonies on high-definition video. His arm began to tremble. The iron bar slowly lowered to his side. The aggressive venom completely drained from his body, leaving nothing but absolute paralyzing fear. I remained seated in my armchair, watching the final structural collapse of my son. He had forged the documents, he had broken the glass, and he had spoken the threats. The evidence was absolute, and the consequences were now entirely out of his control. Cameron stood absolutely paralyzed in the center of my living room. The heavy iron bar in his hand no longer looked like a weapon of intimidation. It looked like the anchor that was going to drag him directly to the bottom of the ocean. He stared at the small blinking red light in the ceiling, molding his chest, rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. I remained perfectly still in my leather armchair, my hands resting flat on the armrests. I told him he had exactly two choices. He could swing that bar and add attempted murder to his long list of federal charges, or he could place the metal on the floor and wait quietly for the authorities. I explained that my security system was fully integrated. The exact second his tire iron shattered the glass panes of my front door, a silent alarm was triggered at the local police precinct. I did not even need to press a button. The system had automatically dispatched multiple units to my address, citing a violent armed home invasion in progress. He did not have time to fully process the magnitude of his mistake. The heavy, suffocating silence of the room was suddenly shattered by the piercing wail of approaching sirens. The sound multiplied rapidly, indicating not just one cruiser, but an entire tactical response team. The pale yellow light from the street lamps was violently replaced by the blinding strobe of blue and red emergency lights sweeping across the walls of my living room. The heavy tires of the police vehicles screeched against the asphalt directly outside my broken front door. The frantic, chaotic energy of his arrival was now entirely eclipsed by the organized, overwhelming force of the law. Cameron looked frantically at the broken doorway, and then back at me, his eyes wide with the absolute terror of a man who finally understands there is no escape. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg for a final shred of mercy, but the words completely died in his throat. The heavy boots of police officers pounded against the wooden planks of my front porch. Bright tactical flashlights cut through the darkness of the hallway, illuminating the scattered shards of broken glass. A loud commanding voice ordered everyone in the house to freeze and show their hands. 3 officers breached the entryway simultaneously, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at the center of my living room. They saw me sitting calmly in the armchair, and then they saw the desperate intruder holding a heavy iron bar. The lead officer screamed at Cameron to drop the weapon immediately and get down on the floor. Cameron did not resist. The arrogant, entitled son, who had demanded my absolute submission just moments ago, simply collapsed. He dropped the tire iron. The heavy metal hit the hardwood floor with a loud, dull clank. He fell to his knees, raising his trembling hands in the air, and then lay flat on his stomach, completely surrendering to the inevitable reality of his actions. 2 officers moved in swiftly, pressing their knees firmly into his back to secure him. The sharp metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like the final definitive punctuation mark at the end of his fraudulent life. The lead officer approached my chair, keeping a watchful eye on the suspect. He asked me if I was injured and if I knew the man on the floor. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket. I looked down at the pathetic figure restrained on my rug. I told the officer that the man was Cameron Montgomery. I stated clearly that he had violently broken into my home armed with a deadly weapon to extort me for financial gain. I informed the officer that the entire violent encounter, including his explicit verbal threats and full confession to federal wire fraud, had been captured on high-definition video and securely uploaded to my attorney's private server. Cameron was roughly pulled to his feet by the arresting officers. His face was pressed against the fabric of his dark sweatshirt, trying to hide from the bright tactical lights. The officer began reading him his rights, the familiar legal words echoing coldly through my living room. Cameron did not look at me as they marched him toward the broken front door. He did not ask for my help. He knew the bridge between us was not just burned, it was entirely demolished and swept away. I stood in the warm circle of light from my reading lamp and watched the police push him into the back of a waiting cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut, sealing his fate. The physical damage to my front door was minor, but the structural cleanup of my life was finally complete. 6 months have passed since the flashing blue and red emergency lights faded from my quiet suburban street. The brutal winter has finally thawed, giving way to a crisp, bright spring. I am sitting at the very same kitchen table where this entire ordeal began, drinking my morning coffee. The stack of legal documents currently resting next to my mug is not a fraudulent loan agreement or a malicious court order. It is a finalized sentencing report from the federal district court. The video recording from my living room ceiling was the absolute undisputed end of my son's arrogant rebellion. When the federal prosecutors presented the high-definition footage of Cameron gripping a heavy iron bar and openly confessing to massive wire fraud, his public defender immediately advised him to surrender. There was no lengthy trial. There was no dramatic courtroom defense. Cameron accepted a strict plea deal to avoid spending decades behind bars. He was sentenced to 4 years in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny, wire fraud, and armed extortion. The man who used to wear custom-tailored Italian linen and drink expensive champagne in Bora Bora is now wearing a standard-issue canvas uniform. His lucrative career in the luxury sector is completely and permanently destroyed. No reputable company will ever hire a convicted felon known for forging signatures and stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The massive trust fund he thought he was destined to inherit has been legally dissolved and securely restructured far beyond his reach. Vanessa did not wait for the judge to strike the final gavel before completely erasing Cameron from her life. Less than 48 hours after his violent arrest, she filed an emergency petition for a legal annulment. She claimed she was the ultimate victim of massive financial deception, completely oblivious to his severe criminal activities. The court granted the annulment with unprecedented speed. A marriage built entirely on stolen equity and fake social status dissolved into absolute nothingness before the ink on their wedding certificate even had a chance to fully dry. I occasionally see her name mentioned in the local social columns. She is desperately trying to re-enter the exclusive country club circles she used to dominate, but the massive scandal sticks to her like a permanent dark stain. The wealthy families she used to impress now view her as a toxic liability, actively refusing to invite her to their lavish dinner parties and charity galas. She is completely isolated in the superficial world she values so highly. Her parents are entirely incapable of helping her rebuild her shattered social standing. Howard and Diane Lawson experienced a financial demolition so absolute, it became a cautionary tale in the local business district. Following the explosive revelation of the forged engineering documents, Gordon Mitchell completely decimated Howard's corporate reputation. The state licensing board permanently revoked his business permits, and the district attorney indicted him on multiple counts of severe corporate fraud and reckless public endangerment. The sprawling luxury estate they used to parade around was swiftly seized by the primary commercial bank and sold at a public auction to cover their massive defaulted mortgages. The expensive leased vehicles were repossessed, and their prestigious country club memberships were publicly revoked for severe non-payment. Vincent Cole, my forensic accountant, recently informed me of their current living situation. Howard and Diane are currently renting a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. Diane, the woman who used to actively sneer at my modest lifestyle, is now working as a part-time cashier at a local retail pharmacy just to help pay Howard mounting legal defense fees. Howard is currently out on bail, confined to that small apartment, wearing a strict monitoring ankle bracelet, while he awaits his own high-profile federal trial. His fake empire of debt and extreme arrogance collapsed, completely burying him under its massive weight. The malicious emergency conservatorship they filed against me was instantly thrown out by the family court judge the very morning Cameron was formally indicted. My bank accounts were immediately unlocked, and my complete financial autonomy was fully restored. I did not lose a single piece of real estate. The commercial bank holding the fraudulent loans was forced to completely void the debt, recognizing that their own internal security measures had drastically failed to verify the forged signatures. My legacy remains absolutely intact and completely secure. I do not feel a single ounce of pity for any of them. They chose to view me as a decaying resource, and they chose to attack the foundation of my life. They learned exactly what happens when you attempt to demolish a structure without understanding the quiet strength of the man who built it. The morning air up here in the mountains is perfectly clear and sharp. I am sitting in a sturdy rocking chair on the wooden porch of a small cabin I purchased 3 months ago. I bought this property entirely in cash, using a fraction of the proceeds from the accelerated sale of the Oak Brook estate. It is a modest structure, built with heavy timber and solid stone. It is not a sprawling mansion designed to impress shallow neighbors or project a fake image of wealth. It is a home built to withstand the harsh elements of nature. I run my hand along the rough grain of the wooden armrest, feeling the absolute strength of the material. There are no imported marble floors here, to echo with empty footsteps. There are no fragile glass tables or velvet sofas. Everything in this cabin serves a highly practical purpose. The architecture is honest, and the foundation is completely secure. I hold a thick ceramic mug filled with dark black coffee. The steam rises slowly, dissolving into the cool morning air. The only sounds I hear are the wind rustling through the tall pine trees and the gentle lapping of the lake water against the wooden dock down below. There are no frantic phone calls demanding emergency funds. There are no condescending remarks from ungrateful relatives about my simple lifestyle. The heavy, oppressive noise of constant entitlement has been entirely eradicated from my daily existence. I take a slow sip of my coffee and let the profound silence wash over me completely. It is a beautiful, heavy silence. I earned this absolute peace. I fought a brutal legal and emotional war to protect my legacy, and this quiet morning on the porch is my ultimate victory. The financial empire I spent 40 years building is now perfectly shielded from greedy hands. Stephen Gallagher and I spent the last few months meticulously restructuring every single corporate asset and personal trust fund. The wealth that was once destined to be squandered on leased luxury sports cars and fake destination weddings is now securely locked inside a philanthropic foundation. I am actively funding engineering scholarships for young, bright students who actually understand the value of hard work and structural integrity. The money is finally serving a noble, lasting purpose. It is building solid futures instead of funding lazy parasites. I look out over the calm, sparkling water, knowing that my life work will outlast me in the most meaningful way possible. I am no longer a human bank account waiting to be slowly drained until I die. I am a man who has completely reclaimed his own worth. The toxic elements of my past have been surgically and permanently removed. Cameron is serving his federal sentence in a facility far away from here. The Lawson family is scattered and struggling in the ruins of their own bankrupt arrogance. I do not think about them with anger or sadness anymore. I simply do not think about them at all. They were a severe structural flaw in my life, and like any competent engineer, I identified the failing components and removed them permanently to save the entire building. You cannot build a peaceful life on a foundation of deceit and ungratefulness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a highly toxic family member is to completely remove your financial support and let them experience the absolute freefall of their own terrible choices. They demanded a life without my rules, and now they are living it. I finish my coffee and set the empty ceramic mug on the small wooden table next to my chair. The sun is fully over the horizon now, painting the surface of the lake in bright shades of gold and deep blue. I am 70 years old, and I have never felt more alive or more internally secure. I learned the hard way that true respect cannot be bought with platinum credit cards or luxury suburban estates. Respect is earned through firm, unyielding boundaries and the absolute refusal to tolerate abuse from anyone regardless of blood relations. I chose my own dignity over a fake relationship with a son who only saw me as a decaying obstacle. That is the end of my story. I hope it serves as a firm reminder that you never have to tolerate disrespect from the people you feed. If you enjoyed hearing my journey, please leave a comment below and share your own experiences. Do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your life. Thank you for listening, and remember that your peace is always worth defending.